The first scream did not come from fear. It came from frustration as dozens of commuters slammed into one another at the bottom of a rain-soaked subway entrance, all because a teenage boy refused to let anyone take another step. "Move," someone shouted, but 16-year-old Jalen Brooks planted both sneakers across the top stair, his soaked hoodie clinging to his shoulders, one hand gripping the cold steel railing while the other stretched across the crowd. Water streamed from his short curls into his eyes, yet he never looked at the angry faces surrounding him. His attention stayed locked on something farther down the staircase, something no one else seemed to notice. A businessman shoved his shoulder. A woman carrying groceries tried to squeeze around him. A security guard rushed forward, convinced he had found the source of the morning chaos. Jalen did not push back. He simply shifted his weight and blocked the path again. "Son, step aside," the guard barked. Jalen shook his head once, breathing hard. "Please, do not go down there." That was all he managed before another wave of commuters erupted with complaints. Someone began recording with a phone. Someone else muttered that teenagers were always looking for attention. The accusations spread faster than the rainwater racing along the concrete steps. Across the platform, Evelyn Harper stepped off the downtown train, her tailored navy business suit untouched beneath a long camel coat. At 58, the billionaire executive had spent decades making decisions in crowded boardrooms, yet the strange standstill unfolding before her caught her attention more than the financial headlines glowing on her phone. She slowed her pace instead of hurrying around the disturbance. Most people watched Jalen's face. Evelyn watched his eyes. They never drifted toward the shouting crowd. They kept returning to the lower landing, where a faded blue duffel bag rested beside the railing as if someone had forgotten it moments earlier. A transit officer noticed the same bag and immediately reached for his radio. The word "suspicious" rippled through the gathering crowd before anyone even touched it. Within seconds, frightened whispers replaced angry complaints. Jalen glanced toward the bag only briefly before staring back at the railing itself. That puzzled Evelyn. If the bag worried him, why was he watching the metal instead? Before she could answer the question, another officer grabbed Jalen's arm. He offered no resistance, only twisted enough to keep looking over the officer's shoulder toward the staircase. A little girl in a yellow raincoat tried slipping through the adults, but Jalen raised his voice for the first time. "Keep her back." The urgency froze even the nearest commuters for a heartbeat. Her mother pulled the child away, confused more than frightened. The officers interpreted the outburst differently. They tightened their grip, convinced the teenager had finally revealed himself as the cause of the panic. Evelyn stepped closer, studying every movement. Something about the scene refused to fit together. Jalen never looked trapped. He looked desperate to stop everyone else from moving. Then, through the pounding rain echoing against the station entrance, a sharp metallic crack echoed from somewhere beneath the crowded staircase, and every face turned toward the sound. The metallic snap rolled through the station like thunder trapped beneath concrete, and every voice disappeared at once. Even the officers holding Jalen loosened their grip for a heartbeat as commuters instinctively stepped backward from the staircase. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. The silence that followed somehow felt even heavier. One transit supervisor hurried down 3 steps, stopped, then looked toward the blue duffel bag before retreating again. "Nobody moves," he ordered into his radio. Yellow emergency tape began appearing almost immediately as more officers rushed into the station. Within minutes, the entrance was sealed, stranding hundreds of frustrated passengers behind temporary barriers, while rain continued dripping from coats and umbrellas onto the polished floor. Jalen stood quietly beside 2 officers, wrists free but closely watched. His breathing finally slowed, yet his eyes still returned to the railing below instead of the abandoned bag that now dominated everyone's attention. News alerts started appearing on phones before anyone knew what had actually happened. Words like "suspicious package" and "public disturbance" spread through the crowd faster than verified facts. Evelyn remained near the security perimeter, studying details that others ignored. She noticed muddy water running beneath the railing. She noticed one section of metal glistening differently under the station lights. Most of all, she noticed that every time someone mentioned the bag, Jalen barely reacted. When another officer questioned him, he answered calmly, "Please check the stairs." The officer frowned. "We are checking everything." "Not everything," Jalen replied softly. "The stairs." His answer earned another skeptical look. Across the platform, a maintenance worker arrived carrying a flashlight and a tool case. Before he could approach the lower landing, a bomb technician instructed everyone to remain back until the duffel bag was cleared. Minutes stretched painfully. The station echoed with distant train announcements that no longer matched reality as delayed passengers crowded behind glass walls. Evelyn watched Jalen watching the maintenance worker instead of the bomb squad. That choice made even less sense than before. Finally, the technician approached the blue duffel bag with careful precision, unzipped it, and slowly removed a pair of running shoes, folded gym clothes, a water bottle, and a basketball. The surrounding crowd released one enormous breath together. Murmurs instantly shifted direction. "See," someone muttered. "The kid caused all this over a gym bag." Angry voices returned, louder than before. Several commuters demanded Jalen be arrested for disrupting rush hour. One man insisted he should pay for every delayed train. The officers escorted Jalen toward a nearby security office as cameras continued recording every step. Evelyn followed at a distance until a transit employee politely stopped her outside the restricted hallway. Through the glass, she could still see Jalen answering questions with remarkable patience. Then a gray-haired janitor pushing a mop bucket paused beside the officers and quietly said, "That boy was standing by those stairs at least 5 minutes before anybody else started yelling." The hallway fell silent. One detective looked up from his notebook. "You are certain?" The janitor nodded without hesitation. Instead of helping Jalen, the statement seemed to harden every suspicious face in the room. Because if he had been there that long, the question no one could answer suddenly became far more dangerous. What exactly had he been waiting for? The detective closed his notebook with a slow, deliberate motion, letting the janitor's words hang in the quiet security office. 5 minutes. That was long enough to notice something. Long enough to hide something. Long enough, many believed, to plan something. Jalen sat motionless in the plastic chair, rainwater still dripping from the cuff of his jeans onto the gray tile floor. He never interrupted as the questions circled back around him. "Why were you standing there before everyone else arrived?" the detective asked. Jalen lifted his eyes for only a second. "I heard something." "What exactly?" A brief pause settled over the room. "Metal." The detective exchanged a doubtful glance with another officer before writing another line in his notebook. Outside the glass wall, Evelyn remained where she could see without interfering. Every answer the boy gave seemed too simple, almost frustratingly simple, yet nothing about his posture suggested someone inventing a story. He did not search the room for sympathy. He did not argue. He simply watched the hallway leading back toward the station entrance as though he feared time itself was running out. A transit employee hurried past carrying maintenance reports, followed by another technician speaking urgently into a handheld radio. Their conversation was too distant to understand, but one phrase drifted through the hallway. "Structural inspection." Evelyn noticed Jalen react immediately. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since she had seen him. That single change caught her attention more than anything he had said. Before she could process it, another voice interrupted the room. "Excuse me." Everyone turned toward the doorway. A little girl wearing the same bright yellow raincoat stepped inside, clutching her mother's hand. She pointed directly at Jalen. Several officers stiffened, expecting an accusation. Instead, the child spoke with quiet certainty. "He pulled me back." Her mother nodded slowly. "I thought he was being rude when he grabbed her backpack. Then I realized he was trying to stop her from running downstairs." The detective looked up. "Did he say why?" The little girl shook her head. "He only kept looking at the stairs." The testimony created an uncomfortable silence. It did not clear Jalen. It simply refused to fit the picture everyone had already accepted. One officer crossed his arms. "Maybe he wanted the area empty before something happened." Another answered, "Or maybe he wanted everyone away from the bag." The detective wrote both possibilities. Neither satisfied Evelyn. She quietly walked toward a wall monitor displaying security footage from different station cameras. Every angle showed the same confusion, except one square remained frozen with a gray error message. Camera 12. Maintenance feed unavailable. She pointed toward it. "Why is that one missing?" A technician barely glanced up. "Connection failure. It went offline before the incident." "Before," Evelyn repeated. "About 6 minutes before." Jalen immediately turned toward the screen. For the first time, genuine urgency crossed his face. That camera points at the lower railing, he said. The room fell silent again. The detective slowly looked from the blank monitor to Jalen, then picked up his radio. I want maintenance at camera 12 right now. If that system recorded anything before the signal dropped, I want every second recovered. The detective lowered his radio only after hearing maintenance confirm that camera 12 had suffered a sudden signal interruption exactly 6 minutes before the station descended into chaos. Nobody in the room spoke. The timing was too precise to dismiss, yet too incomplete to prove anything. A maintenance supervisor hurried inside, carrying a tablet covered with diagnostic charts. He pointed toward the frozen camera feed without looking at Jalen. The camera did not lose power. Something interrupted the connection between the camera and the recording server. One officer shrugged. Equipment fails. The supervisor shook his head. Not like this. Evelyn watched the exchange carefully. She had spent a lifetime making decisions based on incomplete information, and she recognized the dangerous moment when assumptions began replacing facts. Through the security office window, she could see technicians gathering around the staircase, shining flashlights beneath the handrail, while yellow warning tape fluttered in the damp air. Jalen quietly leaned forward. Please check the third support post, he said. The detective frowned. How do you know which one? Jalen hesitated, then answered with the same calm voice that had frustrated everyone since morning. Because that is where I heard it. The detective gave no response, but the maintenance supervisor immediately relayed the instruction over his radio. Minutes later, another technician's voice crackled back. We found surface damage near the third post. Bringing inspection equipment now. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. The discovery did not clear Jalen, but it forced everyone to look somewhere other than the abandoned duffel bag for the first time. Before anyone could ask another question, a transit engineer entered carrying a long metal gauge. Rainwater still dripped from his reflective jacket. The railing is stable for now, he reported, but one internal anchor bolt appears compromised. We need to inspect underneath before reopening the entrance. Jalen slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost as though hearing those words lifted part of a weight he had carried alone. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. Relief replaced tension across his face, but only briefly. When he opened his eyes again, he looked toward the staircase with renewed concern rather than satisfaction. Something still bothered him. The detective noticed it as well. If this was about the railing, he asked, why did you never simply tell the first officer? Jalen looked down at his soaked sleeves before answering. I tried. The room remained still. Nobody stopped long enough to listen. The words landed harder than anyone expected. No anger. No accusation. Just quiet fact. Outside, another call arrived from the inspection crew. The engineer answered, listened for several seconds, then slowly lowered his radio. His expression changed completely. There is more, he said. The anchor bolt did not wear out naturally. Every conversation in the room stopped. What do you mean? The detective asked. The fracture pattern looks unusual. It may have been cut or damaged before today. The possibility transformed the entire investigation in an instant. This was no longer just about a frightened crowd or a teenager accused of causing panic. If the engineer was right, someone might have tampered with the station long before commuters filled the stairs that morning. The detective turned toward Jalen with an entirely different look in his eyes, then issued a new order into his radio. Lock down the entire staircase. Nobody enters until every inch beneath those steps is examined. We are no longer investigating a disturbance. We may be investigating a crime. The staircase remained sealed behind layers of yellow tape as engineers crawled beneath the concrete landing with flashlights, laser levels, and inspection mirrors. Every few minutes, another photograph appeared on the detective's tablet, each one drawing a deeper crease across his forehead. The damaged anchor bolt was worse than anyone expected. Fresh scrape marks surrounded the fractured metal, and tiny steel filings clung to damp concrete below the third support post. An officer quietly whispered, "That does not happen by accident." Yet another immediately replied, "It still does not explain how the kid knew." The question lingered heavier than the rain outside. Jalen sat silently in the security office, watching technicians move across the monitor showing a live feed from the inspection area. He never celebrated each new discovery. He simply waited. Evelyn finally stepped inside after receiving permission from the detective. She stopped beside Jalen instead of across from him. You recognize the sound, she said gently. He nodded once. My grandfather repaired bridges. He used to take me with him during summer breaks. He always told me damaged steel has its own voice if you stop long enough to hear it. Evelyn studied his face. There was no pride in the explanation, only the quiet certainty of someone repeating a lesson he trusted. Before she could ask another question, a maintenance engineer hurried into the room, carrying a cracked section of metal wrapped in an evidence bag. He laid it carefully on the table. The fractured anchor bolt showed a narrow groove that looked almost deliberate. We found this inside the support housing, he reported. The crack began where someone scored the surface before it finally failed. The detective leaned closer. Can you tell when it happened? The engineer shook his head. Not yet. But this did not start this morning. The room fell silent again. Outside the office, frustrated commuters continued arguing about delays, unaware that the morning's inconvenience had become something far more serious. Then another technician called through the radio with unexpected urgency. We found fresh shoe prints beneath the maintenance platform. Everyone turned. Maintenance crew? The detective asked. Negative. Different tread pattern. Jalen looked toward the speaker before quietly saying, Someone was underneath there after I heard the noise. The detective narrowed his eyes. You saw someone? Jalen slowly shook his head. No. I heard footsteps after the metal cracked. Then they stopped. The statement immediately divided the room. One officer believed the boy was filling gaps in his story. Another began reviewing station access logs. Evelyn noticed something no one else did. Jalen never looked toward the blue duffel bag anymore. Since the inspection began, his attention had shifted entirely to the underside of the staircase, as though the abandoned bag had never mattered in the first place. Moments later, a structural engineer returned with another discovery. He projected a three-dimensional scan of the staircase onto the monitor. One support beam glowed bright red. If morning traffic had continued for another 30 to 60 seconds, he said quietly, this section likely would have failed under the weight. The detective stared at the simulation as hundreds of tiny digital figures crowded the staircase. Nobody spoke. The silence itself became an answer. Then the engineer added one sentence that changed everything again. There is only one problem. Every eye lifted toward him. This damage alone could not have caused the connection to camera 12 to fail at exactly the same time. Someone either disabled that camera or wanted nobody to see what happened beneath those stairs. The detective stared at the frozen maintenance camera while technicians worked through layers of corrupted data, but every recovery attempt ended with the same gray screen. Whatever had interrupted camera 12 had erased the only angle that overlooked the lower support structure during the most important minutes of the morning. The structural engineer folded his arms. Without that recording, we can prove the staircase was unsafe. We still cannot prove why the teenager knew before everyone else. The words settled heavily over the room. The earlier discoveries had weakened the accusations against Jalen, but they had not removed them. In the eyes of many officers, he remained the only person who had behaved differently before the station descended into confusion. Outside, television crews had begun gathering behind police barriers as commuters shared phone videos across social media. Headlines flashed across news feeds describing a teenager who had shut down one of Chicago's busiest subway entrances. Few stories mentioned the damaged support beam. Most focused on the disruption. Through the office window, Jalen caught sight of his own image playing silently on a reporter's camera monitor. He looked away without saying a word. Evelyn noticed the movement. Do you have family coming? She asked quietly. Jalen hesitated before answering. My grandmother will hear about this before I can call her. His voice remained calm, but his fingers tightened around the damp strap of his faded backpack. It was the first outward sign that the weight of the morning had finally reached him. Before Evelyn could respond, another officer entered carrying a printed station map. Access logs are clean, he reported. Nobody officially entered the maintenance area before the incident. The detective frowned. Officially, the emergency service corridor was unlocked for ventilation during the storm. Every face turned toward the map. That single unlocked corridor created dozens of unanswered possibilities. Then another surprise arrived. A forensic technician placed a clear evidence envelope onto the table. Inside lay tiny metallic fragments collected beneath the staircase. Machine-cut steel, she explained. Not ordinary corrosion. The detective looked at Jalen. Did you see any tools? No. Anyone carrying equipment? Jalen slowly shook his head again. I only heard someone walking after the sound. One officer sighed impatiently. That is all we have. Sounds. The detective remained silent for several long seconds before making a difficult decision. Until we know more, we cannot treat him as only a witness. Evelyn stepped forward immediately. He warned people. A little girl would have gone down those stairs if he had done nothing. The detective met her eyes with visible regret. And if he knew because he witnessed the damage being created, that changes everything. No one answered. The possibility hung between them like another storm cloud refusing to move. An officer gently asked Jalen to stand. He complied without protest. As he was escorted toward another interview room reserved for more formal questioning, he paused beside the window overlooking the sealed staircase. Workers below had begun installing heavy steel supports beneath the damaged landing. Jalen watched them with quiet intensity until one laborer suddenly signaled upward, pointing beneath the third support post. Radios crackled all at once. Several engineers rushed toward the same spot with flashlights. The detective instinctively reached for his own radio. Before anyone inside could learn what had been found, every monitor in the security office went black for a single heartbeat. When the screens returned, camera 12, silent all morning, displayed one frozen frame that had never appeared before, and every person in the room realized someone else had been standing beneath that staircase just seconds before the recording disappeared. Every conversation stopped as the recovered frame expanded across the largest monitor. The image was grainy, streaked by rain and digital interference, but it showed enough to erase the certainty that had driven the investigation all morning. Beneath the staircase, partially hidden by the third support post, stood a person wearing a dark maintenance jacket with the hood pulled low. The figure was crouched beside the damaged anchor housing while holding something long and metallic. The timestamp read exactly 43 seconds before Jalen stepped across the top stair to stop the crowd. Can you enhance it? The detective asked. The technician was already typing. Pixels sharpened slowly, revealing the outline of a portable tool bag resting beside the unknown worker. The face remained hidden. The next frame appeared. The hooded figure suddenly looked over one shoulder, abandoned the tool bag, and disappeared into the emergency service corridor just as camera 12 dissolved into static. Nobody in the room spoke. Evelyn looked toward Jalen. He had never taken his eyes off the screen. There was no satisfaction on his face, only quiet recognition. That is why you kept watching the stairs, she whispered. Jalen nodded once. I heard the metal first. Then I heard someone running underneath. The detective replayed the sequence again and again. Every earlier assumption began collapsing under its own weight. The abandoned blue duffel bag had never drawn Jalen's attention. The shouting crowd had never been his concern. Even the officers pulling him away had unknowingly forced him to stop watching the place he feared most. Then another technician raised his hand. There is audio. Static filled the speakers before faint echoes emerged beneath the rainfall. A sharp grinding sound scraped through the room, followed by hurried footsteps beneath the staircase. Seconds later came Jalen's voice, distant but unmistakable. Stop. Everybody stay back. The timing matched perfectly. The grinding sound ended. Jalen moved. The crowd kept walking anyway until he physically blocked the entrance. Evelyn slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment. Every choice the teenager had made since the first second now fit together with painful clarity. He had never been trying to control people. He had been trying to buy time. The detective looked down at the reports accusing Jalen of causing panic. Without a word, he folded them closed. A structural engineer entered almost at the same moment, carrying fresh inspection photographs. One image showed the damaged anchor housing after debris had been cleared. Deep parallel tool marks lined the fractured steel, matching the grinding sound captured by the recovered audio. This was intentional, the engineer said quietly. Someone weakened the support before rush hour. The room remained frozen until another officer rushed inside, holding a printout from station access records. We found something else, he said, breathing hard. One maintenance identification badge was used to unlock the emergency corridor this morning. Who does it belong to? The detective asked. The officer looked down at the page before answering. That is the problem. The employee assigned to that badge retired almost 3 years ago. The detective immediately grabbed his jacket and turned toward the door. Seal every exit. Find whoever used that badge. As officers raced into the hallway, Evelyn glanced at Jalen. For the first time that morning, people were no longer asking whether he had caused the danger. They were finally asking who had truly created it, and somewhere beyond the sealed station, the person from the recovered footage was still free. The station transformed from a crime scene into a command center within minutes. Officers spread through every platform, maintenance tunnel, and service corridor, while technicians traced the retired identification badge through years of archived maintenance records. The search moved quickly, but the atmosphere inside the security office became strangely quiet. For the first time that morning, nobody was questioning why Jalen had blocked the staircase. They were asking how many lives he had unknowingly protected. The detective walked toward him, stopped a few feet away, and carefully removed the incident report from his clipboard. Without saying a word, he tore away the first page that identified Jalen as the source of the disturbance. He folded it once and placed it into a recycling bin beside the desk. It was a small gesture, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Evelyn watched Jalen's expression. The teenager did not smile. He simply looked back toward the staircase where engineers continued reinforcing the damaged structure. His attention had never been on himself. A forensic analyst entered carrying another evidence envelope. Inside rested fine gray dust collected from the abandoned tool bag, recovered beneath the support platform after officers reopened the maintenance space. Laboratory comparison matched the particles to the freshly cut anchor housing. The detective nodded slowly. That confirms the tool bag belonged to whoever damaged the support. Another officer added a second discovery. Fingerprints on the abandoned basketball inside the blue duffel bag belonged to a local college student who had already reported losing the bag during the morning commute. The suspicious package that had consumed everyone's attention had been nothing more than forgotten gym equipment. An uncomfortable silence filled the room as several officers realized how completely they had been distracted by the wrong object, while Jalen had been trying to warn them about the real danger. Evelyn quietly crossed the room and stood beside the detective. "The crowd followed the loudest story," she said. The boy followed the only sound that mattered. The detective lowered his eyes before turning toward Jalen. "I should have listened when you kept pointing at the stairs." Jalen answered with the same calm voice that had carried through the entire morning. People were scared. They looked where everyone else was looking. The words lingered long after he finished speaking. Outside, structural engineers completed temporary reinforcement beneath the staircase before conducting a controlled load test. Dozens of weighted pallets replaced commuters on the repaired landing. Everyone watched through the glass. The damaged section groaned softly before settling against the new steel braces. One engineer finally raised a thumb. The staircase held. Several workers quietly applauded. The detective received another call moments later. The retired badge had been duplicated months earlier using stolen maintenance credentials. Security cameras from a nearby street captured a vehicle leaving the service entrance shortly after the station was evacuated. The investigation had shifted decisively away from Jalen and toward identifying the unknown suspect. Evelyn stepped aside to make one phone call of her own. Within minutes, she instructed her foundation to fund an independent safety review of aging transit infrastructure across the city, beginning with the station where everyone had nearly learned the truth too late. Before leaving the office, she returned to Jalen and handed him a dry jacket from her security team. He accepted it with quiet gratitude, replacing his soaked hoodie for the first time since dawn. Through the wide station windows, the rain finally began to ease, and sunlight slipped through the clouds onto the newly reinforced staircase. Yet one unfinished detail remained. The detective held the recovered frame from camera 12 in his hand, studying the hidden figure beneath the hood. He knew who had been blamed. He knew who had been right. But until the person in that photograph was found, the story that had begun on those rain-slicked steps was not truly over. 3 weeks later, the morning rush returned to the Chicago subway station with the familiar rhythm of footsteps, train doors, coffee cups, and hurried conversations. Fresh steel supports disappeared behind newly finished concrete, leaving little evidence that the entrance had once stood only seconds away from disaster. Commuters crossed the staircase without slowing, most unaware that its quiet strength had been rebuilt because one teenager had refused to step aside when every voice demanded that he move. The criminal investigation continued beyond the station walls. Detectives identified the man captured beneath the staircase as a former contractor who had illegally duplicated an old maintenance badge after losing city contracts years earlier. His abandoned tool bag, the recovered audio, the machine marks on the fractured anchor housing, and surveillance footage from surrounding streets formed a chain of evidence that finally closed every unanswered question left behind by the damaged camera. The mystery that had consumed the city no longer pointed toward the teenager who had blocked the stairs. It pointed toward the person who had hoped no one would notice the danger until it was too late. Inside the transit headquarters, the detective requested one final meeting before the case file was completed. Jalen arrived wearing the same faded backpack that had rested on his shoulder throughout the longest morning of his life. Evelyn Harper joined them quietly, choosing a chair beside him rather than across the room. The detective stood instead of sitting. He placed the original incident report on the table, now stamped with a bold correction identifying Jalen as the primary reporting witness whose actions prevented a mass casualty event. Then he slid the document aside and extended his hand. "I saw a problem," he said softly. "You heard one. Next time, I hope I remember to listen before I decide." Jalen accepted the handshake with the same calm expression he had carried through every accusation, every question, and every hour of waiting. No speeches followed. None were needed. Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked with Jalen through the station, where workers were removing the last sections of temporary fencing. She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a full scholarship to a summer engineering program sponsored by her foundation, along with an invitation to visit one of the city's bridge restoration projects. Jalen looked at the papers for several quiet seconds before carefully placing them inside his faded backpack. "My grandfather would have liked this," he said. Evelyn smiled gently. "I think he already did." Before they parted, the little girl in the yellow raincoat ran across the platform holding her mother's hand. She waved enthusiastically before disappearing into the crowd, never realizing that her small gesture carried more gratitude than any public ceremony ever could. Weeks later, the Transit Authority installed new structural monitoring sensors throughout older stations and introduced updated emergency reporting procedures that required officers to evaluate unusual safety warnings before dismissing them as public disturbances. None of the signs displayed Jalen's name. He never asked them to. One clear autumn morning, he descended the repaired staircase on his way to school. Sunlight spilled through the station entrance, catching the polished steel railing that had once echoed with the sound only he had recognized. Around him, hundreds of strangers moved confidently toward another ordinary day, never knowing that the safest journeys are sometimes protected by the one person everyone else believed was standing in the way.